Now, in the Colombian context, Colombia currently procures between 40 and 60% of its food from home. Right? It produces 40 to 60% of its food domestically, suggesting that there is a potentially large scope for displacement as we open up to free trade with the United States. Now, I'm sorry that number is so fuzzy, 40 to 60%. I kept seeing much different estimates of how much food Colombia produces at home. But it stands to reason that those numbers are going to drop substantially as domestic production comes to be displaced by foreign production. Let's see, it's estimated by Oxfam that some 28% of small-scale farmers' crops will be affected almost immediately as soon as the FTA goes into effect. The total value of agricultural production is estimated to be reduced by about $218 million per year in Colombia if this free trade agreement goes into effect. And it's thought that 15,000 fewer jobs for agricultural laborers will be had in rural Colombia as a consequence, almost immediately within a year or two of the FTA going into effect. Now, these are estimates from Oxfam. Now, in the Panamanian case, there are very similar concerns, and a lot of the opposition to the FTA in Panama has been from rural producers groups. So, for example, the movement of campesinos of the Rio Cobre in Panama, they called the United States the shark in the context of the FTA. And their recent letter suggests the shark, as many of us campesinos call the desperate expansionist policy of the United States government, claims to be seeking progress and economic development for us campesinos by signing what they call the Free Plunder Agreement. But they say that we prefer to remain poor, ignorant, and needy rather than to lose our dignity and love for the land. Right, so we've seen enormous opposition from the small farm communities in both Colombia as well as in Panama. Just to read you another piece, this one letter was written to Congress by the National Agricultural Organization in Panama, written to the United States Congress, in which they compare their plight to the plight of farmers in Mexico, who, as I'm sure you have all read about, have suffered, small-scale farmers in particular in the corn sector, have suffered enormously since NAFTA went into effect in 1994. We've seen a massive displacement of Mexican peasant farmers by U.S. producers. The estimates range from 2 million to 6 million peasant farmers displaced, and as many of you know, these folks have migrated into urban areas and as well as across the border to the United States. And so it's in this context of a comparison to Mexico that this Panamanian Farmers Organization is writing to Congress. They say that the FTA will cause great displacement in the Panamanian agricultural sector, on which 40% of our nation's population depends, either directly or indirectly. We Panamanians do not want to follow the Mexicans and Central Americans in the flood of immigration to the United States, where many risk their life trying to be able to make a living. And I think this letter really calls to our attention the spillover effects. We're not just talking about food insecurity among rural populations, but the feedback effects that that insecurity has in terms of migratory flows to urban areas, putting burdens on urban services, urban housing infrastructure, as well as burdens upon international relations in the context of migratory politics. So from the perspective of small peasant farmers in in Panama and Colombia, I think we can expect an increase in food insecurity as a consequence of the FTAs as they are displaced, as livelihoods are displaced and food prices become more volatile. Now, in the context of the recent food price crisis, I think we can gain another kind of indication of the kinds of insecurities that we might see in Panama and Colombia as a result of these FTAs. Now, as you all might know, food prices started climbing pretty dramatically in 2006 into the summer of 2007 and through 2008. You might recall paying like $4 a gallon at the gas pumps, right? This was around the time that food prices also started to rise, at least in part because of the feedback between gas and commodity prices. Now, looking at this case study of how Panama and Colombia were impacted by these rising food prices, I think gives us a potential indication of the sorts of insecurities we might see become more prominent in Panama and Colombia as this food price volatility is passed through more readily to their populations. So in the Panamanian case, there were a number of household surveys done about how folks in Panama weathered the food crisis. And these household surveys have shown that across all households in Panama, irrespective of socioeconomic status or geographical region, that we've seen families on average reduce their caloric intake by 8% as prices rose between 2006 and 2008. A full 87% of households in Panama with children under the age of 2 did not consume the recommended daily number of calories per family member, such that rising prices in the recent context has caused real insecurity among children and families in both urban and rural areas in Panama. And I think we can look forward to more of this as the FTAs allow for easier pass-through from world to domestic markets. Now, another interesting point I think to be made in the Panamanian case is that in the context of the recent food price crisis, the government actually intervened to stabilize rice prices for folks in urban areas and in rural areas who can no longer afford the spiraling price of rice. The government ended up going onto world markets and buying rice high and selling low to urban and rural consumers who were having trouble purchasing rice, suggesting that another indirect cost, in addition to urbanization and migratory flows, another indirect cost of these FTAs might be an increased burden on governments in bailing out hungry people in Panama as food price volatility becomes more of a reality. Now, the Colombian context is also really instructive, I think, here. In Colombia, 13% of children are chronically malnourished, and 10% of children are estimated to be below their ideal weight. Given averages across different age groups and genders. Now, this is the case despite the fact that Colombia's economy right now is relatively insulated. Its agricultural sector is relatively insulated from these global dynamics, a situation that would really be reversed when these FTAs are put into place. Now, as I mentioned, in Colombia, somewhere close to 60% of food is currently produced domestically, and this has insulated Colombia from a lot of the food price shocks that have occurred recently. However, as domestic consumption, or excuse me, domestic production is replaced by foreign production, I think we can see a lot of this insulation disappear. A lot of the built-in insurance that countries have when food production is done mostly domestically will be eroded. And in the Colombian case, I think that, in the context of the recent food crisis, several heads of state made the comment that, well, we didn't suffer nearly as much as many other countries in Central America and in South America. We didn't suffer nearly as much, for example, as Haiti did or as Panama did, precisely because so much food was produced domestically, that domestic markets were more insulated from the global shocks than they would have been otherwise. Now, this is a situation, again, that stands to be reversed with these FTAs as more and more domestic production is given over to foreign production. So I'm going to stop right there, and again, just to sum up, right, in the context of these FTAs, what we see is a displacement of domestic production by foreign production. And while many advocates argue that this will make food cheaper, because the United States makes corn cheaper, wheat cheaper, rice cheaper than the farmers do in Panama and Colombia, in my opinion, I think this creates at least two avenues for seriously rising food insecurity. One, we see the displacement of peasant production, leading to increases in rural hunger and rural poverty. And in addition, we see the potential for vulnerability to shock, both in terms of natural disasters as well as in terms of global price shocks. And these are shocks and vulnerabilities that will impact both the rural and the urban poor as they try to procure food. So let me stop right there.
Thank you very much. Now we'll hold off our general discussion until after all three guests have spoken, but we could take, if anyone would like to ask a question of clarification, if you would like a definition or something of that nature before we move on to our next speaker. Yeah.
I just had a quick question about when you were talking about the percentage of children malnourished in Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that number is also greatly impacted by the civil war that's been going on a lot? I'm just wondering how that fits in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. Food insecurity in Colombia is rooted in all sorts of interesting things, from displacement off the land to insecurity and violence ongoing. So absolutely, I think it certainly is. My point was only to suggest that I think those numbers will rise with these FTAs. So thank you for that clarificatory question.
Any other questions, just of clarification? Thank you. And we'll go then to Dr. Kulkarni, who will give us a somewhat different perspective on free trade agreements.
Well, I don't think I'm going to give any different perspective, because Sasha has done a wonderful job. I know Sasha is our graduate from Cornell here, and then she finished her PhD. And I'm just impressed what a great job we have done on her. That she's so eloquent and so organized, and she has presented her view very well, nicely. And I do take some credit for that, because she was in my class about 12 years ago. And I could have threatened her to change her grade if she had not spoken well. But I'm very happy to be here. I know HORD has been a very active organization on this campus for a while. I have spoken with them before, especially talking about the Iraq War and the economic effects of war on the economy before. But I'm just very happy to be back here again. I know I'm going to take a little different approach now. We will start with some macro approach of benefits from international trade. Then we'll talk about a micro approach of just having free trade agreements and what is the economic analysis for that and why do we do that. And then we'll probably talk about the food, and then I will leave it to Kara Martinez to talk about the actual food effects and the food trade between Panama, Colombia and US that we are signing the free trade agreements with. Well, as far as the macro approach is concerned, and as far as the economic effects of international trade are concerned, we have humongous support from economic literature, not just for this period, but also for all the last 150 to 200 years that economics is in existence. Right from the days of Adam Smith, then Ricardo, who talked about how international trade will benefit for the countries for exploiting a lower cost or a higher efficiency production so they can export those, and the world will benefit from this international trade program. And in general, the theoretical basis that Ricardo started became quite popular in early 1900s and all. Well, that proposition was further studied and extended by two Swedish economists, one guy named Eli Heckscher, another guy Bertil Ohlin. Ohlin, by the way, is the Nobel Prize winner. But according to Bertil Ohlin, Heckscher, Ohlin, and then further extended by Samuelson, the argument was that, well, international trade is so great that once we have international trade between two countries, then there can be what is called a factor price equalization. And by factor price equalization, we mean, of course, the wages will tend to go up in labor-abundant countries, because that's where the labor will be cheaper, and international trade will benefit your abundant factor, namely labor in labor-abundant countries and capital in capital-abundant countries. So capitalists, those who are owners of the capital, will benefit from the capital-abundant countries, and those who are the owners of labor, namely the workers, they will benefit from a free trade agreement between a labor-abundant country and a capital-abundant country. Now, with that kind of work in 1940s and all, we obviously got another further boost to a free trade movement, and in 60s and 70s, economists obviously extended different diversifications of this basic hypothesis. And in 1980s, as you know, the new movement, namely the neoclassical economist movement of globalization and the benefits of globalization and all, which obviously put even more emphasis on trading. Now, while all this theory was going around, if you look at the empirical evidence, there are obviously several examples that you can put forward where international trade is the key for economic growth of those countries. Even now, as we speak, the fastest growing economy in the world, namely China, obviously has seen the benefits because of international trade. The second fastest growing country, India, has seen the benefits because of international trade. The third fastest growing country in the world, Brazil, has seen the benefits of international trade. And the fourth one, probably Russia, has also opened up in the last 20-25 years. So in general, even if you look at the most modern data in the last 20-25 years, countries that have done international trade have obviously benefited, and they are the fastest growing. But those are not exceptions. If you look at Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, then Australia, New Zealand, most of the European countries, Belgium, Norway, Sweden, all of them have seen the benefits of international